The Dead and the Dying, written by Leon Hamilton, featuring Nightwatcher 666, Kyle Norris, Brady Bettis, Hunter Jordan, Creepy Face, Chillers and Thrillers, Paul J. Mcsorley, Olivia Steele, Geoff Sturtevant, and Melissa Medina. Prologue, 2019, Nuevo Paraíso, Ecuador. A medical research team led by virologist Francine Gilbert and Bernard Holman of the CDC were investigating the report of a deadly viral outbreak. The report was from a local physician that traveled to a small village deep in the Amazon. His note stated that the infection spread quickly and started with flu-like symptoms. It quickly became a high-grade fever and triggered a violent psychosis. Infected patients would have to be restrained to be treated. Despite the doctor's best efforts, the fever led to death in every case. His notes go on to state that he had made a mistake. The subjects he believed dead were waking up and attacking people. After narrowly escaping the village, Dr. Emil Suarez filed his report with the CDC and vanished. After days of traveling on boat and on foot, the research team found the village. There was no one left. According to the information provided, there were 30 people in the village. The team located 7 bodies. All of them had been stripped down to the bone. The rest of the villagers were nowhere to be found. Once all the samples were collected, Holman had his men follow blood trails found in different areas of the village. They were tasked with locating an infected survivor. Out of the 4 men that were sent, only 1 returned. He was badly injured and claimed he had been attacked by cannibals in the jungle. Gilbert, Holman, and the remaining members of the team left the village and returned to the United States. 3 years later, a virus of unknown origin swept the globe. After quarantines and mass vaccinations, the virus mutated and continued to spread. 2 years after that, outbreaks of the virus began to show up around the world. Act 1. Chapter 1. Overtime. Silently smoking a cigarette and gripping the wheel, Jerry sped down the highway on his way home from work. In the distance, he could see an ocean of brake lights waiting for him.
Just great.
It had been a long day, and all he wanted was a beer, a blunt, and the remote for the TV. But traffic had other plans. Normally, this stretch of highway was smooth sailing. Tonight, it was a parking lot. As his car came to a stop, he let out a disgusted grunt and started trying to see what was causing the problem. In the distance, he could see police and emergency crews working to clear the wreck off of the road. Thinking it wouldn't be much longer, he relaxed in his seat and turned up the radio. Traffic crawled along for close to half an hour, till he was sitting next to an ambulance that had been on the scene. The EMTs were standing near the rear of the vehicle, closing the doors, and he got a quick glimpse inside. There was a person covered in a white sheet on the gurney. As the door shut, he could have sworn he'd seen the person move. Brushing it off, thinking he'd imagined it, he hit his cigarette and turned his attention back to the road. It took 10 minutes to pass the wreck, and another 20 before he got home. The next morning, as he was drinking his first cup of coffee, he turned on the television to catch the weather. He sat through the usual barrage of bad news, high prices, strikes, and natural disasters. Then, just when he thought it was over, there was a breaking story. It was about the wreck he had seen the night before. A woman, who had apparently passed out behind the wheel, was involved in an accident. Her name was Francine Gilbert. She was pronounced dead at the scene, but somehow revived on the way to the hospital. According to the paramedics involved, the woman had to be restrained after waking up and violently attacking them. Of course, they blamed it on drugs and mental illness, but something about it made him uneasy. Maybe he'd seen too many movies, or maybe he was overthinking it, but to him, it felt wrong. The weekend flew by, and by Monday morning, he'd forgotten all about Francine and her miraculous recovery. After putting his uniform and staring at himself in the mirror for a second, he grumbled,
Well, fuck my life.
Then headed off to work. After everything he'd been through, he never thought he'd end up being a security guard. Every day was a monotonous, repetitive blur of bullshit and boredom. At this point, he spent the majority of his days praying for something to happen, but it never did. As the hours slid by, he watched the helicopters landing and taking off from the hospital across the road. They were busier than usual. Normally, he'd see 2, maybe 3 helicopters a day, but there had been 10. The roads were busy as well. He'd been hearing sirens and seeing emergency crews scrambling throughout the day. Another odd thing he'd noticed was the amount of people walking along the road. His post was located in an isolated area. There were a few small subdivisions around. The complex he was working for actually sat on the edge of one. Still, it was rare to see anyone walking in this particular area. Other than his post and the hospital, there was nothing on this road besides a sewage processing station. Once again, he chalked it up to his imagination building a scenario to keep himself entertained. Around 5:30 p.m., Sergeant Phillips, a stout, older man with a shiny bald head and a bushy gray beard, stopped by to do a post check and shoot the shit. When he was done with his checklist, he stepped out of the booth and nodded.
All clear as usual. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is, you're doing a great job. The bad news is, your relief called in and I'm going to need you to do it for a little longer. I'm trying to get someone in right now, but I'm not getting any responses.
Shaking his head and letting out a sarcastic chuckle, Jerry patted his pockets, looking for his smokes. Once he held them, he got one lit and glanced up at the sky, noticing a wall of dark clouds rolling in.
No response, huh? Sounds about right. Because you're not getting a response from me either. I'm not pulling a double. I still haven't gotten paid from the last time. So fuck off and find somebody else.
The Sarge laughed and pulled his belt up.
Shit rolls downhill, son. And guess who's at the bottom of that hill?
He paused to look at Jerry, then started towards the golf cart.
Look on the bright side. You get some OT. A little extra money never hurts.
Knowing arguing wouldn't change anything, Jerry scowled and stepped in the booth, slamming the door behind him.
Fuck this job.
He grumbled before flopping down in his chair and pulling out his phone. Queuing up a good scary story on YouTube, he turned up the volume and started sketching to pass the time. It wasn't long before those dark clouds he'd seen blotted out the sun and thunder rumbled across the sky. Around 7 o'clock, as the sun began to set, the first few drops of rain fell. By the look of things, it was going to rain all night, and if his relief didn't show up, he'd be stuck doing patrols in it. As that thought crossed his mind, the alarm for his 7:30 patrol sounded. Tilting his head back and closing his eyes, he took a deep breath and muttered,
They don't pay me enough for this shit.
Getting up and grabbing his reindeer, he cursed and grumbled complaints to himself. Normally, this would be where he'd radio command and tell them he was starting his patrol. In his agitated state of mind, he slipped the radio in his pocket, grabbed his keys, and stormed out of the booth. The facility was huge. Each patrol covered 16 different checkpoints around the complex. By the end of the night, he would have covered 96 checkpoints in all, with the majority being outside. The first stop was Building E, a medium-sized tin building with a roll-up door. It was supposed to be used for storage, but at the moment, housed the golf carts used by the facility's work crew. He just finished checking the doors when the rain came pouring down. Luckily, Building G was next. It had cover and he'd be able to hold up there for a second. Hurrying over, he locked the doors from the receiving bay, then scanned the marker and stood watching the rain. From where he was standing, he could see the sliding gate leading to the retention pond. There was also an area just beyond the trees that was used for testing. The company manufactured drilling equipment, and from time to time, they used the prototypes over there. It wasn't unusual to see animals back there. He'd seen deer, rabbits, possums, and a skunk, to name a few. But tonight, the moment he caught something out of the corner of his eye, he got nervous. At first glimpse, it was hard to make out. His initial thought was deer. When he focused on it, he saw a man wearing a gray t-shirt and tan shorts walking the path leading to the test area. Grabbing the radio, he watched the guy for a few seconds, then called it in.
Patrol 1 to command. Come back.
There was a burst of static. Then Phillips replied,
Send it.
I've got a situation at the east access gate. I've got a single male heading into the testing area. Please advise.
Do not approach. I say again, do not approach. I'll call the authorities and file an incident report. Stay put, I'm heading your way.
Copy that.
Slipping the radio back into his pocket, Jerry watched the trespasser till he vanished behind the trees. After a few minutes, Sergeant Phillips arrived on the golf cart. Rather than stopping near Jerry, he rode over to the gate and checked the lock first. When he was done, he hopped back on the cart and rode over.
The police are on their way. Were you able to get a good look at that guy?
Shaking his head and pointing to the area he'd first spotted the man, Jerry described exactly what he had seen. Because of the distance and the rain, he hadn't seen much, but there was one detail that stuck out. The trespasser was limping. It didn't seem to be stopping him, but it was noticeable. Phillips mentioned the terrain back there being rough and thought the guy had probably turned an ankle. Not knowing the area well enough to argue, Jerry agreed to the possibility. But what the Sarge said next caught him by surprise.
All right, go back to your station and switch all cameras to the perimeter. Stay in the booth. Armed personnel will be doing all the patrols tonight. If you have to use the shitter, go to Building J and keep your radio with you at all times.
Seeing Phillips so wound up instantly made him alert. Normally Sarge was fairly laid back and rarely wore his pistol. Tonight, his .45 was on his hip, and he was looking concerned.
What happened? Should I get my gun out of my car?
Legally, I can't say yes to that. But if it happens to happen, I'll look the other way. There was an incident at the hospital. We're getting reports of a riot.
Like a full-blown riot? Or just a bunch of people yelling and talking shit?
This one's looking pretty real to me. Some kid got shot by the cops at the hospital. The details we're getting aren't making any sense. The boy was 14 and in critical condition before being shot by the police. The kid had been hit by an ATV a few days earlier. Like I said, the reports don't make any sense. All we know is the kid got killed and people are mad about it. So far things are escalating and unfortunately we're right across the road from it.
As the Sarge finished talking, Officer Briggs from Guard Station 1 came over the radio.
US-1 to command. Police have arrived and are headed to your location.
After clearing the call, Phillips sent Jerry back to his post. During the walk back, he stopped by his car and got his pistol out of the glove box. As he closed the door, a patrol car pulled up and let down his window. Jerry told him where to find the sergeant, then hurried back to the booth and opened the gate. Once he'd gotten out of his rain gear and put on a pot of coffee, he took a seat at the desk and started switching the cameras. The moment the rear gates came on screen, there was a problem. There's a bayou that runs behind the building, separating it from the residential neighborhood. Occasionally, people would jog the paths or walk their dogs back there, but it was considered a low-traffic area. Tonight, there were 3 people standing near the fence. At first, they weren't moving. They were all sniffing the air and looking around till something caught their attention. As the group took off running, Jerry realized that they were headed straight for the Sarge. Grabbing the radio, he tried to warn them.
You've got 3 people approaching from the rear of the property. Don't open the gate.
No response. Quickly switching camera 2 to the east gate, he saw the police officer and Sarge with their weapons drawn. There was no sound of the feed, but he could tell they were yelling commands at the trespassers. Whatever they were saying, it wasn't working. Taking a good look at the people, Jerry realized one of them was a little girl. The other 2, a man and a woman, were banging against the gate, but the girl was looking for a way in. Trying the radio again, he yelled,
Watch the girl. She's headed for the access gate.
Hearing the call, Phillips turned to see the girl as she squirmed and squeezed her way through the slight gap between the rolling gate and the fence. The moment she was inside, she ran at Sarge. Rather than shooting her, he stepped back as she charged. When she got too close, he kicked her in the chest, sending her sprawling backwards across the ground. The officer rushed over to get the girl under control, quickly overpowering her. He put her in a squad car, but not before taking several bites to his hands and arms. At this point, the other 2 made their way to the access gate, but all they could do was reach their arms through the gap. Mesmerized by what was unfolding on the screen, Jerry hadn't been paying attention to what was happening around him. A lone figure with a slight limp ran through the open field that sits on the right side of Jerry's post. He didn't see him until his hands were smacking against the glass. Nearly falling over in his seat, Jerry spun around and locked eyes with the teenage boy. Frantically pounding his palms against the window, he begged for help. Letting him in would be breaking the rules, but judging by the look of it, the kid was in danger. Hopping up from his seat, Jerry went to the door and hurried the boy inside. As the door slammed shut, the kid limped over to the window, started looking in the direction he'd just come from. Without taking his eyes off of the window, he nervously muttered,
They're trying to kill me.
Who's trying to kill you?
Jerry fired back while locking the door.
I don't know. They just started chasing me.
Relax. Nobody's getting in here. The police are already on site. Sit down, catch your breath, and tell me what happened.
Doing as he was told, the boy took a seat and tried to get himself together. Once he'd calmed down a little, he explained.
I was taking a shortcut through the bayou because it was raining. When I got to the trail, I saw those freaks huddled around something on the ground. As soon as they saw me standing there, they came after me, so I ran. I thought I'd lost them when I found that spot behind the trees, but they're here now. Please, man, you've got to help me.
Getting a good look at the kid for the first time, Jerry noticed a bloody wound on his left calf.
Calm down. What's your name?
Aiden.
Okay, Aiden. You're bleeding pretty bad. What happened to your leg?
I don't know. I think that bitch tried to bite me. Everything was happening so fast I couldn't pay attention. She caught me by the water before I crossed the bayou. When I got there, she fucking tackled me and we fell in. She was clawing at me, trying to drown me. I just kept kicking till she let go. When I got to the other side, my leg was hurting, but I had to run because others were coming.
Making a mental note of everything he just heard, Jerry grabbed his first aid kit and did his best to bandage the kid up. Once he was done, he turned his attention to the monitor and froze. Sarge and the police officer weren't on the camera. Grabbing the radio, he tried making contact, but got no response from Phillips or Briggs in GS1. Quickly switching cameras, he caught sight of the Sarge running to Building E. The officer was on the ground near the generators, being attacked by the guy from the gate, while the woman ran after Phillips. Trying not to panic, Jerry split the screen and brought up the feed from GS1. The booth was empty, and Briggs's car wasn't in the lot.
That motherfucker,
he mumbled to himself before glancing out the window at his own car. Thinking of making a run for it, he side-eyed Aiden and considered leaving him there while he had the chance. As that thought crossed his mind, the sight of 3 more police cars racing down the street made him smile. Thinking they were about to pull in the lot, he pressed the button to open the gate, then watched in shock as they sped by without stopping.
No. Where the fuck are they going?
Grabbing the flashlight off of his desk and rushing out into the street, he tried to flag them down, but it was too late. Standing by the side of the road, the sound of gunfire in the distance made him pause. Between the thunder and the pouring rain, he could have been mistaken, but as it continued, there was no doubt. Something was happening. Jerry had seen enough and turned and headed straight for his car. As he crossed the driveway and stepped into the grass bordering the parking lot, Aiden, who was standing in the doorway of the guard shack, yelled,
"They're coming! Run!"
4 figures were racing towards him. There was no way he'd get to his car before they got to him. With no other option, Jerry darted for the shack, managing to slip inside and slam the door before they got to him. The shack was made of steel and concrete, with thick bulletproof glass and a heavy metal door. As long as that door was locked, there was no way anyone was getting in. Soaking wet, Jerry doubled over, gasping for air. Years of smoking and bad living had left him in shitty shape. After taking a moment to gather himself, he noticed Aiden was curled up in a ball, hiding under the desk. Standing up straight and wiping the water out of his eyes, Jerry could hear the dull thudding of them pounding against the glass. It was so thick that their fists barely made a sound. Since they couldn't get inside, he took a moment to get a good look at their faces. One was a young woman with short hair, wearing a Sonic's uniform. There was a location near the freeway. He assumed she'd come from there. The right side of her face had been ripped away, exposing her skull and now empty eye sockets. Her arms were a mess of shredded flesh and splattered and smeared bits of skin and blood on the glass. Next to her was an older guy in a torn red flannel shirt. He was missing an arm, and his intestines dangled from a gaping hole in his gut. He snarled and pressed his face against the glass, attempting to bite his own reflection. The third was a kid with dreadlocks. There was an open wound on his neck, still gushing blood, as he frantically clawed at the window. The last of them had already lost interest and was wandering towards the road. It was a woman. Since her back was turned, Jerry couldn't get a good look at her. Judging by the way she was moving, he guessed her legs had been badly damaged.
What the fuck is going on?
He muttered to no one in particular as he watched the Sonics girl get distracted by something to her right. Glancing in to see what grabbed her attention, Jerry's jaw dropped. The sliding gate was still open, and Sergeant Phillips was on the golf cart, being chased by the man and woman from the east gate. When he sped by, the ones that had been banging on the window joined the chase. He made it halfway across the parking lot before the kid with the dreads caught up and jumped on the cart. Trying to shake him off, Phillips made a hard left and hit a parking block. The impact caused the car to tip over, landing on its side, sliding a few feet before coming to a stop. The kid was trapped under the cart, still swiping at the Sarge as he crawled out and got to his feet. Pulling his sidearm and firing into the swarm, he ran. He dropped 2 of them, but they were getting up. If he could make it to the command center and get inside, he'd be safe. But that was still a ways to go, and they were right behind him. Luck was on his side. As fast as those things were, they weren't all that coordinated. The rain was making the pavement slick, causing a couple of them to slip and fall. Only one was still close to him when he made it to the door. The flannel guy had somehow stayed upright, even though he was dragging a train of his own intestines. Easily avoiding the one-armed attack, Sarge brought the gun up and put a bullet through his brain. The flannel guy dropped and went still, buying Sarge just enough time to scan his badge and get inside. Letting out a sigh of relief, Jerry flopped down in his chair and covered his eyes with his hands for a second. Once he'd gathered himself, he turned his attention to Aiden.
They're gone. You can come out now.
The kid didn't respond, so he leaned forward to get a better look. The boy's eyes were wide open, but he wasn't moving.
Shit.
Grabbing his pistol off of the desk, Jerry got up and headed for the door. The crowd was still at the command center. He could get to his car now. Taking one last look out of the window, making sure the coast was clear, he made a break for it. He was out of the door, across the lot, and in his car faster than he thought, but he wasn't alone. He hadn't seen the shredded corpse of the police officer shambling towards the passenger side of the car. His body was so damaged, he barely looked human. All the skin from his face and chest had been ripped away. His arms had been chewed down to the bone, and he'd been partially gutted. When he smacked against the window, Jerry nearly shit his pants. His first reaction was to grab the gun and fire, shattering the window and deafening himself in the process. Ears ringing and distorted, he fumbled for the keys for a second while the thing outside the window pounded on the side of the car. The commotion got the crowd's attention. As they ran and hobbled their way towards him, he managed to get his keys in the ignition. The cop, who was now reaching into the car, took a few messy swipes at Jerry, splattering clumps of bloody flesh everywhere as he cranked the engine. He wouldn't be able to pull the car and drive with the thing so close to him. Taking the gun out of his lap, he fired a second shot. This time, its head snapped back and it stopped moving. Throwing the car in drive, Jerry mashed the gas and sped out of the lot, watching his pursuers vanish from sight in the rearview mirror. Chapter 2. Bad Neighbors. Laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Daniel listened to his neighbors fighting. He'd never met them, but after a year of this, he knew their names. Frank, the husband, was a bad drunk, or at least that's what Daniel thought. Frank would come home, yell at Anna, the wife, until she either stormed off and slammed the door, or fought back. Tonight was different. Someone crossed the line, and things had gotten violent. At first, they were just yelling, then came a loud smack. Daniel couldn't tell who hit who, but the arguing stopped and the sounds of a scuffle started. It didn't last long. There was a heavy thud, and everything got quiet. He could hear a slight thumping sound, mixed with a sort of muffled grunting, that lasted a minute or two, then nothing. No screaming, no arguing, no movement at all. It was as if they both dropped at the same time. Sitting up and grabbing his phone, Daniel paused when he heard the sound of footsteps, followed by the slam of the front door. Phone in hand, he slipped out of bed and went to his front door to sneak a peek through the peephole. The dim hallway lights gave his view an eerie feel, but there was no one there. He'd missed whoever it had been, but it didn't matter. Judging by what he'd heard, Someone was hurt, and possibly dead. Dialing 911, he called for help, then tried to go back to bed. It wasn't long before he heard a sound coming from next door. The police hadn't arrived yet, so he knew it wasn't them, but there was no denying someone was moving around. At first, there was a slow groaning sound, then an explosion of noise as whoever it was started thrashing the place. When the police finally arrived, things got worse. After pounding on the door shouting, "Sheriff's Department," they kicked it open and started yelling for the person to get on the ground. One of the officers yelled, "Taser deployed." Then everything went crazy. It took a moment for Daniel to realize the cops were the ones screaming for help. "Officer down!" a distressed voice called out. Seconds before shots were fired. Falling out of bed and crawling across the floor, Daniel hurried to the restroom and took cover in the bathtub. More shots rang out from the hallway, followed by screaming, then quiet. An unfamiliar sound drifted in after a few seconds. A muffled, wet smacking mixed with an almost animalistic growl could be heard. The combination sent an odd sensation of confusion and fear through Daniel as he lay there listening. It almost sounded like someone was eating. The more he focused on it, he was almost certain that's what it was. Sirens approaching cut through the noise, followed by the sound of the person in the hall taking off running. He couldn't tell which direction they had gone, but it didn't matter. As long as they weren't at his front door, he felt safe enough to get out of the tub. Stepping out of the restroom, he could hear police in the parking lot barking orders through their PA system. Curiosity got the best of him. Quickly moving to his bedroom window, he peeped through the curtains to get a look. He could see the squad cars and officers, but he couldn't see who they were talking to. After a few seconds, a figure rushed in, and the police started shooting. They pumped him full of rounds, but he wouldn't go down. He ran straight at them and managed to grab one of the officers. That's when Daniel saw him. It was Frank. He'd been shot at least a dozen times, and he had a knife sticking out of his neck, but he was still moving. He was tearing into the cop he tackled, was taking bites out of his face and neck.
What the fuck?
Daniel muttered just before a dull thud from his front door nearly scared him to death. Turning to face the noise, the smell of blood and gunpowder wafted in. A second thud reverberated through the room. There was a force behind this one. The impact caused a picture to fall off of the wall and sent whoever was on the other side of the door into a frenzy. They snarled and banged against it, sounding more like a wild animal than a human being. Lost somewhere between panic and shock, Daniel stood silently staring at the door, mouth dry, heart pounding. His mind raced to the conclusion he needed a weapon. The only thing he had was an old aluminum bat he kept next to the bed. Keeping his eyes glued to the entrance, he moved slowly, trying not to make any noise. About halfway across the room, the pounding at the door stopped, and so did he. Shouting and sirens from the parking lot turned to white noise. In his mind, whoever was in that hall was about to come crashing in at any second. Taking a deep breath and holding it, he darted for the bat, grabbed it, and turned to swing. But nothing happened. After a long moment of silence, he exhaled slowly, then quietly made his way to the front door and stopped. There was a pool of blood on the floor that was coming from the hall. Doing his best to avoid it, he nervously stepped up and took a look through the peephole. Other than a body on the ground, the hall was empty. He couldn't see exactly what was wrong with the person, but there was a lot of blood. More gunfire from the parking lot made him jump and back away. Whatever was happening, he wanted no part of it. Staring at the growing pool on his floor, he frowned, then headed to grab some towels to soak up the mess. After using nearly all of his towels, he flopped down on his sofa, listening to the chaos outside. The police were everywhere. He thought it would be all over soon, but it wasn't. Hours passed. There were 2 more shootouts, the last one being right outside his door. When it was all said and done, 5 bodies were removed from the scene by men in hazmat suits. Less than an hour later, the entire complex was quarantined. As soon as the announcement was made, everyone, including Daniel, stepped out of their homes and started asking questions. As the crowd gathered, he stepped back to get out of the way and wound up standing off to the side. It didn't take long for things to get out of control. People refused to be prisoners in their own homes. One lady attempted to get in her car to drive away and was arrested on the spot. That was the tipping point. Some kid in the back of the crowd threw a bottle at the cops, and everyone went nuts. Backing away from the surging crowd, he glanced to his left and saw a girl with her cell phone out, live streaming the chaos. He watched her for a moment before someone went sprinting by screaming for help. The girl with the phone turned to film him and was blindsided by what looked like a homeless woman. The impact was brutal. When they hit the ground, the bag lady started attacking the girl, snarling and screaming. The bag lady mounted the girl, pinning her down. She unleashed a flurry of punches and attempted to bite the girl before someone stopped her. A couple of guys that had been standing nearby grabbed the bag lady and pulled her away. During the struggle, she bit one of them. The guy let go. She attacked the second man. He'd seen enough. Daniel ran full speed back to his apartment and locked the door. Chapter 3. Groceries. The alarm clock on Sydney's nightstand blared to life, as it did every morning. And just like every morning before, she groaned, then turned it off and got up. Dragging her feet across the carpet, she went to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. Once it was ready, she poured herself a cup and headed to the backyard to get some air. As she opened the patio door, noise flooded in, sirens in the distance, and the voices of her neighbors caught her by surprise. Typically, it was dead quiet at this time of the morning. Now, it seemed like the whole neighborhood was up and in a hurry. From where she was standing, she could hear her neighbor Roy going to his tool shed. Stepping out and flagging him down, she got his attention.
Hey Roy, what's going on? Why is everybody getting up so early?
With a slightly frazzled look, he shook his head.
Oh, hey Sid. Something happened at the hospital. People are going crazy all over the city. A bunch of us are going to the stores early to stock up in case things get bad. You should come. There's no telling how long this might last.
Nodding and taking a sip of her coffee, Sid watched Roy grab a couple of 5-gallon gas cans from the shed. As he walked off, she couldn't help but notice the 9mm holster on his right hip.
Think I'll sit this one out. You guys be careful out there. Call me if you need anything.
She said, before taking another sip. Loading the cans in the trunk of his car, he paused to look at the house, then at her.
Andrew didn't want to come with us. Could you keep an eye out for him? We shouldn't be gone long.
She told him she would. He thanked her, then quickly got into the car with his wife, Beth, and drove away. Andrew, their son, was 16. Sydney didn't know much about the kid. She rarely saw him outside. When she did, it was in passing. From what she could see, he seemed like any other teenage boy. Shrugging off the strangeness of the situation, she watched as they joined in a small convoy headed for the highway. She felt like they were overreacting. It would probably blow over in a couple of days, and they'd be stung with a bunch of extra shit. Laughing to herself, she went inside and went on with her morning. 2 hours later, Roy and his wife pulled into the driveway in a hurry. They immediately started hustling their bags into the house, while Beth kept nervously looking around. When they were done, the two of them, carrying 2 bags apiece, hurried over and knocked on Sydney's door. The moment she opened up, Roy handed his bags to her, then took Beth's and sat them just inside the door. As he set the bags down, Sid noticed a bandage on his right forearm.
Thanks. Is everything okay? What happened to your arm?
Glancing down at the bandage, Roy started to say something, but Beth nudged him to speed things up.
It's not important. Lock your doors and stay inside. Do you have a gun?
Shocked by the question and confused by how they were acting, Sid shook her head no. Showing her his hands, Roy reached behind his back and pulled a revolver from his waistband, then handed it over.
There's a box of bullets in one of those bags. Have you ever used a gun before?
The weight of the pistol in her hand somehow snapped her back to reality.
There's bullets in the bag? Why are you giving me a gun? What the fuck is going on?
Hesitantly, he shrugged.
We don't know. We were at Costco checking out. The next thing I know, people are running and screaming. When we got to the parking lot, things got worse. While we were loading the car, some kid attacked me. Everything happened so fast. I didn't see him till he bit me. I closed the trunk and he was just there, on me, sinking his teeth into my arm. He was so small, he couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. When I snatched my arm away, he fell and I got in the car. Beth cranked the engine when I got in, but by then there was a crowd running towards us. I've never seen anything like that. They chased us till we got back on the highway. That's all we know. I gave you the gun because we saw stuff happening all over the neighborhood on our way in. So I'm gonna ask you this again. Do you know how to use a gun?
Staring at the pistol in her hand, Sid silently nodded her head.
Good.
Roy said before stepping back.
If you need anything, call us.
With that, he and Beth hurried off back to their place. As they passed their car, Sid noticed the side mirror had been broken, and there were bloody smudges on the windows. For a moment, her mind went blank. She stood in the doorway, gun in hand, staring at the car till a blue Ford pickup came speeding past her house. She didn't recognize the driver, but she knew the truck. It belonged to Mr. Henry at the end of the block. He was a thin, old man with long hair and a bushy beard. The person driving was a woman, and there was a kid in the passenger seat. As they sped by, a group of people ran behind the truck. Caught up in the shock of the moment, Sid watched right up until one of them spotted her. A chubby kid with bright red hair, wearing a white Rick and Morty t-shirt, instantly changed course and ran straight at her. Snapping out of her daze, Sid shut the door, locked it, and stepped back just before the kid came crashing through it. Screaming and blindly firing a shot in the kid's direction, she turned and ran for the back door. As she darted across the living room, he caught her. The weight of him jumping on her back drove her face first into the tile floor. The impact broke her nose and knocked out her front teeth before the boy started pounding on the back of her skull with his fists. Flashes of white light exploded in her vision every time he hit her. She felt every blow till he bit into her. All she could do was scream through a mouthful of blood and broken teeth as her world finally faded to black. Chapter 4. Stranded. Jerry's escape hadn't gone well. After being forced to exit the freeway, His car started smoking and broke down. He wound up at a gas station on the corner of Crooks and 12 Mile Road. The rest of the night had passed quietly, but now the sun was up, and all hell had broken loose. After spending the night in the back seat of his car, Jerry woke to the sound of horns blaring and people arguing. Sitting up, rubbing his eyes, he paused, shocked by what he was seeing. He scratched his head. There were cars lined up at the pumps and jamming both roads leading in. A tall, thin man carrying a gas can was arguing with an older woman who'd been fueling up a large SUV. As they were going at each other, the passenger of the SUV, a heavyset guy wearing a blue hoodie, got out and came around the back of the vehicle. When he stepped out, he surprised the other guy, causing him to drop the can and reach for his waistband. The man in the hoodie put his hands up and stepped back as the pistol came into view. At that point, the woman who'd been at the pump took off running towards the front of the store. Jerry couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The thin man yelled, "I told you I'd pay for it! All you had to do was fill the fucking can!" Now waving the gun around, he angrily snatched his can off of the ground, then went to fill it. When he was done, he put the nozzle back in the SUV's tank, then dug in his pocket, pulled out some money, and tossed it on the driver's seat.
Well, it could have been worse.
Jerry muttered to himself as the man with the gas can went running past his car. Getting out and stretching, he stood there for a second, taking it all in before someone yelled over to him.
"Hey, aren't you security? Why didn't you try to stop that guy?"
Snapping out of it, he turned to see the guy in the blue hoodie walking towards him.
Well, shit.
He grumbled to himself, realizing he was still in uniform. Before he could respond, the blue hoodie guy yelled,
"Hey, shithead, I know you hear me. Why didn't you do your fucking job?"
Jerry went from confused to pissed off, but he stayed calm.
My job? I don't work here. You need to get your wife, get back in your car, and call the police.
He was trying to de-escalate the situation before things got even more out of control. It didn't work. The guy kept yelling and getting closer. Reaching for the pistol on his hip, Jerry stepped back. That one motion stopped the guy dead in his tracks. He held up his hands and started to back off. As the guy in the hoodie walked away, Jerry noticed how many people were now out of their cars, using their phones to record everything. Something about them triggered flashbacks of those dead-eyed freaks he'd seen the night before. For a split second, they were corpses, bloated, disfigured, saggy bags of flesh, holding up their phones for their 5 seconds of fame. Squeezing his eyes shut and rubbing his face, he tried to get past it. His hands were shaking and his mouth was dry. The adrenaline rush was fading. Gathering himself and patting his pockets, he pulled out his cigarettes and lit one. Taking a drag and holding in the smoke for a second, he exhaled and looked around. The intersection was packed with cars, and the lines stretched on for blocks. As Jerry stood, scanning through the crowd, a woman in a champagne-colored BMW caught his attention. She was coughing into a fistful of Kleenex and clutching the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her up. After a few seconds, she stopped moving and slumped over on her side. Jerry watched as the BMW rolled forward and hit the car ahead of it. It wasn't a hard impact, but it was enough to piss off the driver. When the guy got out, yelling, he saw the woman needed help and rushed over. Realizing what was going on, a few other people got out of their vehicles and joined in the effort. Her doors were locked and the windows were up, so they wound up having to break the glass to get her out. Once they had her on the ground, more people gathered around as another woman from the crowd tried to resuscitate her. After a couple of attempts at CPR, the woman looked up and shook her head. As she did, the woman from the B&W sat up and bit her in the face. The woman screamed as her cheek was ripped away, and the crowd went crazy. Some ran for their cars, and others ran in to help. Almost everyone who tried to get involved got bitten or scratched. None of the injuries seemed fatal, and most of them got away. But one guy was too slow. The BMW lady chased him down and tackled him. Then, after ripping his throat out, she gutted him and started stuffing fistfuls of his intestines into her mouth. Wide-eyed, with a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, Jerry stared at what was unfolding in front of him. His first thought was to get in his car, but with the broken window, he wouldn't be safe. As he looked around, a small group of people were hustling into the store. Trying to keep an eye on what was happening in the street, he pulled his pistol and made his way over to join the crowd. Being at the back of the pack, he could see everything. While people were fighting and crowding the doorway, the BMW lady had dropped a fistful of guts on the ground and was headed their way. Without thinking, he took aim and fired 2 shots, hitting the woman in the chest. The bullets didn't stop her, but they caused the crowd to scatter in all directions, confusing her for a second and giving him a clear path into the store. Once he was inside, he stood watching the BMW lady tear into some teenager who'd been knocked down in the stampede. The boy kicked and screamed as she bit into his chest, then pulled away a mouthful of t-shirt and flesh. Somehow, the kid managed to squirm free, but before he could get away, she bit into his stomach. Grabbing her by the hair and punching her in the face a few times, the boy managed to get her off of him. Getting to his feet as quickly as he could, he turned and ran before the lady could attack him again. She got up and chased him for a second, before veering off and going after someone else. Jerry watched the chaos outside for a brief moment before the click of the door lock made him jump. He turned around to see the attendant, a young woman with dark hair whose name tag said Carla, and 6 other people. Looking around the store, he paused for a second when he saw the blue hoodie guy and his wife. They were standing near the coolers. Both of them were on their phones trying to call for help. Across from them, standing near the slushy machines, there was a guy wearing gray scrubs. He was using napkins to clean up a wound on his forearm while talking to someone on the phone. Jerry was just about to say something about it when the woman who'd been looking out the window blurted out, "That guy's getting up!" The other 2 people, an older man wearing a mechanic's suit and a homeless-looking guy, both stepped over to the window to get a look. Turning to see for himself, Jerry's stomach lurched. The man that had been attacked first was on his feet. What was left of his organs and intestines sloshed out, spilling down his legs as he staggered, then ran straight for the store. Chapter 5. Run. Daniel sat staring at his computer screen, mesmerized by the live streams coming from all over the city. Violent attacks were happening everywhere, including right outside his front door. After an incident with a woman in the parking lot, a full-scale riot kicked off. It had been going on for hours. Most of the screaming stopped just before sunrise, but now he could smell smoke. Getting up from his seat and going over to the window, he nervously peeped out for the first time since he'd locked himself in. There was blood splattered all around the parking lot, but there were no bodies. From what he could tell, there was no one outside, and the complex was on fire. Fighting the urge to panic, he set his mind to grabbing the things he thought he'd need and filling up the backpack he used for hiking. It wasn't big, but it held a couple of bottles of water and snacks along with extra socks. Once the bag was packed, he got dressed. All those years of narrating horror stories were about to be put to the test. First, he put on 2 sets of thermal underwear, followed by his jeans and his steel-toed work boots. Next, he put on a hoodie, followed by his leather jacket. Lastly, he wanted to protect his face and eyes. Unfortunately, all he had was a pair of goggles he'd used for a costume last Halloween and a scarf. The smoke was getting thicker. He didn't have time to be picky. Putting on the goggles and wrapping his face as best he could, he grabbed the bat and his bag and then headed out. Heat met him in the hallway. He couldn't see the flames at the far end, so he hurried to the stairs coming out near Mary Street. Things looked a lot different at ground level. There were body parts left in chunky pools of blood, and he could hear screaming coming from the neighborhood. Looking to his left, he could see people running. They hadn't spotted him yet, and he wanted to keep it that way. From that distance, he couldn't get a good look at them, but there was blood on their clothes, and that was enough for him. To his right, the coast was clear. He'd be passing through the neighborhood. There were a lot of houses between him and 12 Mile Road. If he could get there, it was a straight shot to his cousin Sydney's place. He tried calling her, but she didn't answer. That wasn't out of the ordinary for Sid. She rarely answered the phone. His plan was to make it to her house and get her to drive them out of the city before things got any worse. Taking a deep breath, he hurried through the parking lot and started jogging once he'd passed the retirement home. On his right, a white 2-story house with a for sale sign in the yard caught his attention. The front door was open, and there was blood smeared on the wall leading in. Trying to ignore the groaning coming from inside, he picked up the pace. As he passed a set of duplexes in the next lot, he heard a raspy snarling and huffing coming from behind him. Glancing back, he caught a glimpse of an old man wearing a blood-soaked bathrobe, rushing towards him.
Shit.
His jog turned into a full-on sprint. The guy was catching up, and he couldn't let that happen. Ahead of him, on the left, he could see someone staggering down the walkway, heading for the street. It was a teenage girl. She was hobbling on a badly broken left leg, and her shirt had been torn, revealing a shredded, bloody mess of exposed ribs and dangling flesh. Trying not to look, Daniel raced by as she swiped at him with gnarled arms that threw her off balance, causing her to fall. The old man stepped on her and fell as well, but got right back up and continued his pursuit as Daniel made a left on the next street. A few houses down, you could see a man standing next to a beat-up red truck. There were 2 bodies on his lawn, and he was shooting at someone who was running at him from the street. The blast dropped the bloody naked man. Then the guy with the gun jumped in his truck and cranked the engine. Daniel tried flagging him down, but it didn't work. All he could do was keep running while the truck sped away. The old man behind him wasn't giving up, and now the girl was dragging along behind him. Further up the block, he could see people. Lucky for him, the guy in the truck was running them down and drawing their attention. The small crowd chased the truck and vanished around the next corner as the truck made a left onto 12 Mile Road. By the time he'd made it to the corner, there were 5 people chasing him, and he was running out of steam. The street was alive with people and cars, trying to turn around to get out of the traffic leading to the gas station. There was no time to focus on anything but running. Daniel turned right and darted up the street. As he got closer to the gas station on the corner, he saw a woman running around, banging on people's car windows. Praying she didn't notice him, he ran as fast as he could, with his pursuer still hot on his heels. His luck went from bad to worse when he saw a disemboweled man banging on the front of the gas station. Making a hard right, He ran to the back of the building and nearly shit himself when he saw a box truck blocking the alley. With nowhere to go but up, he rushed over and climbed on top of the truck. From there, he crossed a small extension on the back of the building and got on the roof. As soon as he was sure they hadn't been able to follow him, he took the scarf off of his face, then doubled over and puked his guts out. Chapter 6. Growing Pains. The sound of his parents, Roy and Beth, hustling groceries into the house caught Andrew by surprise. He could hear them talking about something that happened at the store, so he paused his game and went to see what all the commotion was about. When he stepped into the living room, the first thing he noticed was a bandage on his dad's arm.
What's going on? What happened?
He asked before going over to help with the bags. His father stopped for a moment to look at him, then dug in his pocket and handed over a set of keys.
We'll talk about it later. Go to my safe and get the .357 and a box of ammo for it. Hurry up.
Doing as he was told, he went to his parents' room, but when he got to the safe, he hesitated for a second. His dad had never given him the keys to the safe before. Smiling to himself, he slipped the key in the lock and opened the door. His dad called it a safe, but it was more like a locker. There were 10 weapons in it. 4 pistols, 2 hunting rifles, a shotgun, and 3 assault rifles. Each weapon had its own section, with the ammunition stored beneath it. For a second, all he could do was stand there staring at everything. He didn't snap out of it until he heard his mother calling for him.
Drew, hurry up! We have to get moving!
Grabbing the .357 and the ammo, he hurried back and handed everything over. Beth checked the weapon, then loaded it, and passed it to Roy before putting the box of ammo in a bag of groceries. Picking up the bags, she looked at Andrew and smiled.
Everything's gonna be alright. Go grab all the heavy blankets you can find and pile them in the hall. We'll be right back.
With that, Beth and Roy, carrying 4 bags apiece, hurried out of the front door to drop off a few things to their neighbor Sydney. Watching from the window, Andrew saw his parents talking to her for a moment before his dad handed her the gun. Since he was supposed to be collecting blankets, he missed the end of the conversation. He'd just thrown his first armful of blankets out of the hall closet when his parents got back. As soon as the door slammed shut, his mother called out to him. When he got to them, they sat him down and tried to explain it, but before they could really get started, the sound of a car speeding down the street interrupted them. Before anyone could say anything, there was a loud crash, followed by a gunshot, and screaming from next door. Andrew's first reaction was to get up and go to the window, but his father stopped him. They sat silently, listening to the sound of their neighbor being attacked, and when it was over, his mother looked at him with tears in her eyes and shook her head.
Drew, listen to me. There's something happening out there. People are killing each other. Your dad almost had to shoot someone just to get gas. We're going to stay here as long as we can, but we have to leave. I need you to understand. Things could get really bad. If we get separated or if something happens to me and your father, go to your Uncle Pat's house in Franklin. That's where we're going if we have to leave. Do you remember how to get there?
Thinking about it for a second, Andrew shook his head. He'd only been to his uncle's house twice, and both times he'd slept most of the way. His mother smiled and patted him on the leg.
That's okay. Go get your phone, your backpack, and an extra pair of shoes. Bring them to me, then help your dad put everything away.
Speechless, he sat there for a second. There were a million questions racing through his mind, but he couldn't seem to get the words out. Finally, after looking at his parents one last time, he nodded, then went to collect the stuff his mom had asked for. When he got to his room, he could hear noise coming from the outside, so he went to his window. Being as quiet as he could, he peeped out and saw two people coming out of Sid's house. Instantly recognizing one of them, his jaw dropped. It was Mark Fisher. He was still wearing the Rick and Morty shirt he'd had on the last time he'd seen him. He was covered in blood, and there were huge sections of flesh missing from his arms. There was a woman with him Andrew didn't recognize. She was naked from the waist down, covered in bites, and missing half of her right foot. Watching them stagger across the lawn, the reality of what he was seeing hit him.
Holy shit,
He muttered, backing away from the window. Shaking his head, trying to get the image out of his mind, he got busy. Once he had everything, he rushed back to the living room, handed everything over, then went to the kitchen. Roy was in the process of putting away canned food when he walked in.
Hey, champ, about time you got here. Thought I was gonna have to do this by myself.
Nervously scratching the back of his neck, he spoke up.
Hey, Dad, I looked out the window. Mark and some lady were coming out of Sid's place, and they looked...
Roy cut him off.
Jesus, Drew, did anyone see you?
No, I don't think so. But Dad, they looked dead. What's going on?
Stopping what he was doing, Roy gave his son an almost sad look.
I wish I could tell you, but we don't know. The important thing is we're together. As long as we stay that way, we should be fine.
Nodding his head, Andrew got to work putting away the food. As they were finishing up, his mother called him. When he got to her, she handed him his phone.
Your uncle's address is saved on Google Maps, and I packed a few things you'll need in your bag. I've also marked out the way there on a map that's in the side pouch, just in case you can't get a signal or you lose your phone. I hope you don't have to use any of it, but it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it.
Hearing her say that made him smile. She said it about almost everything. It was her slogan. Slipping the phone into his pocket, he hugged her and then went to his room and flopped down on the bed. The sounds of sirens and gunfire in the distance made him nervous. The thought of being out there alone was horrifying. How was he supposed to make it all the way to Franklin without help? And what if Uncle Pat wasn't there? Or worse, what if he was dead? What would he do then? As that thought crossed his mind, the idea of losing both his parents put a knot in his stomach. Trying to put it out of his mind, he went to his computer and got online. There were posts coming in from all over the world. He even saw one of the apartment complexes not far from his house. People were calling the attackers zombies. Going by the video and live streams, it was hard not to. He'd been seeing posts like this for years. Before now, he'd never taken them seriously. With what was going on, he started wondering if they'd been real all along. As he was skimming through the multitude of posts, a request for a video chat hit his inbox. It was Amanda. They'd known each other since they were babies. At one point, she'd lived next door to him. When her mom got a job in Texas, they moved away, but they managed to stay in touch. Now, they played games together online and FaceTimed each other at least once a week. Happy to see her name pop up, he quickly jumped right into the call. The moment her face took over the screen, his heart dropped. She was crying, and he could hear screaming in the background.
Are you okay?
Were the only words he got out before there was a loud crash that caused Amanda to look away. She screamed as a figure rushed into the frame, tackling her, taking her off screen. All he could do was gasp and cover his mouth, and couldn't see what was happening, but he could hear it. Amanda's screams were quickly replaced by snarling and the meaty packing sound of someone's fist caving in her skull. He didn't want to watch it, but he couldn't take his eyes off of the screen. When the smacking sound stopped, another sound took over. A wet, nauseating squelching mixed with a muffled grunting filled his headphones and burrowed into his brain as tears started to flow from his eyes. He watched in shock as more people crossed the screen and joined in the feast. Soon, there were so many he couldn't see around them. When they were done, and the last of them had finally wandered off, the room was a silent, bloody mess. Andrew sat on his bed, staring at the screen. He couldn't believe what he'd seen. It left him in a daze. After what seemed like a long time, a new sound crept in. A low, gurgling groan slowly took over. Snapping out of his stupor, Drew rubbed his eyes and focused on a lone figure struggling to its feet. It was her. It was Amanda. For a second, he thought she'd survived, but the moment she stumbled into frame, that hope died. Her jaw was broken, her nose was gone, and she was missing an eye. Her arms had been stripped down to the bone in some places, and her guts had been ripped open. Andrew's stomach lurched as bile filled his throat, forcing him to snatch off his headphones and make a dash for the restroom. Hearing him violently vomiting into the toilet, Roy came to check on him.
Hey, champ, what's wrong?
For a moment, Andrew couldn't respond. The image of Amanda shambling across the screen was still too fresh in his mind. Wiping drool off of his chin, he shook his head before muttering.
They killed her.
With a concerned look, Roy asked what he was talking about. Still in shock, Andrew silently led his father back to his room and showed him the open call with Amanda. Surprisingly, she hadn't left like the others. She was standing in the center of the room, swaying from side to side, while staring straight ahead. Narrowing his eyes and focusing on the screen, Roy frowned, then ended the call. Turning to face his son, he didn't know what to say. There were no words that could change what he'd seen, so he didn't try. Instead, he stepped over and hugged him. Then after a moment, pulled away.
Sorry you had to see that. I know she meant a lot to you. I won't pretend to know how you're feeling right now, but if you want to talk, your mom and I are always here.
Sobbing and nodding his head, Andrew took a seat on his bed and sat silent till his dad finally walked away. The day passed slowly after that. He felt like it was all a bad dream, and the chaos outside was just in his mind. As the sun began to set, the street had gone silent, but sirens and gunfire echoed in the distance. His parents were busy covering the windows with blankets. Meanwhile, he'd been watching Sid's house through the small crack in the blinds. She'd been chasing something from room to room, but he couldn't see what it was. From what he knew, she didn't have any pets, but her front door had been broken down, so something could have gotten in. When she wandered out of sight and didn't come back, he figured she'd either caught what she was after or gotten out. Just as he was about to turn away, his mother knocked on the door as she opened it.
Hey, Drew. Your dad told me what happened. Are you okay?
As much as he wanted to say no, he knew his parents needed him to stay focused, so he nodded and managed a slight smile. Beth could see the hurt in his eyes, but rather than push the issue, she nodded, then handed him a blanket and a box of thumbtacks.
Good. Now, listen, I need you to cover that window. Make sure no light can escape. We don't want anyone noticing we're in here. When you're done, come to the front room. There's something we need to do.
Once she walked away, Andrew quickly did as she asked, then went to see what was going on. When he got to the front room, he was shocked by how dark it was. The only light came from the glow of the television. They had the sound muted and the closed captions on. Without saying a word, he walked over and took a seat between Roy and Beth. They watched footage coming from all over. It was happening in every city on the map. No place was safe. Everything was moving so fast, the reporters didn't know what to say. They were telling everyone to shelter in place, and avoid contact with anyone acting strange or violent. There were no clues on what it was, where it came from, or how it was being spread. After getting frustrated by the lack of information, Roy changed to another station, then sat back.
Glass and blankets ain't gonna cut it. I don't think we can stay here. The roads are probably chaotic right now, but it's not gonna get any better if we wait.
Nodding her head, Beth thought about it for a second, then glanced around the room.
Okay. I think we should get some rest and hit the road first thing in the morning. That should give us enough time to pack a few things. What do you think, Drew? You up for a road trip?
Nodding and getting up from his seat, Andrew thought about it for a second, then asked,
What if we get attacked?
Roy and Beth shared a look. Then he calmly replied,
If it comes to that, your mother and I will handle it. But the truth is, there's a chance you'll have to defend yourself. Just remember what we taught you and only shoot if there's no other choice.
For the last few years, Roy and Beth had been taking Andrew to a shooting range and teaching him how to clean and maintain his weapons. He didn't really like guns. The only reason he played along was to make his parents happy. Now, there was a chance he'd have to shoot someone, and the thought made him queasy. Trying not to let his nervousness show, he nodded and smiled like he always had, then went to his room. The night seemed to drag on forever, and Andrew couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned till he finally managed to doze off, only to be woken up a short while later by his mother shouting,
Drew! Get out here now!
He tumbled out of bed and stumbled to the hall, where he found her piling furniture in front of her bedroom door. He could hear snarling and banging coming from the inside, and he didn't see his father.
What's happening? Where's...
Your bag's by the front door. Go! I'm right behind you!
His mother commanded, cutting him off before he could finish his question. Still groggy and confused, he hesitated till a loud crash came from inside the room.
Come on! We've gotta go!
She grabbed him by his arm and rushed him to the front door where their bags had been set for the next morning. In a flash, they had their things and were rushing out the front door. As they crossed the driveway and got into the car, a small crowd came rushing towards them. The noise was attracting them. Andrew could see more, coming as his mother cranked the engine and threw the car in reverse, hitting some of the closest ones as they backed out. Stomping on the brakes and throwing it in drive, Beth hit the gas, and they sped away. Chapter 7. Out of the Frying Pan. Jerry sat near the front of the store, staring at the crowd building up outside. A few hours earlier, someone had ran by and brought the crowd with him. Now, they were piling up around the gas station. It had gone from 1 freak to 7 in a heartbeat, and now there were at least a dozen of them out there, banging on the glass. Making matters worse, the guy in the gray scrubs, Justin, was bit. He'd been in the bathroom puking his guts out for the last 45 minutes. The mechanic, Greg, and the woman who'd been at the window, Bridget, were standing near the restroom talking. Carla and the blue hoodie guy's wife, Tammy, were watching the news on their phones and updating everyone whenever they'd hear anything new. Meanwhile, the homeless guy, Bugs, was stuffing his pockets with whatever he could get his hands on. Looking around at everyone, Jerry shook his head and got up. Calling over to Carla, he asked,
Is there a back door to this place? I'm not staying here.
Glancing up from her phone, Carla nodded.
Yeah, there's a door in the storeroom that leads out to the dumpsters. But there could be more people back there waiting. Besides, the news is telling everyone to shelter in place, so I'm not sure it's safe to go out there.
Safe? Look around, lady. It ain't safe to stay here. Sooner or later, that glass is gonna break, and they're gonna get in. I don't want to be here when that happens.
The blue hoodie guy, Harold, chimed in.
Okay, tough guy. Where are you going? The news says this is happening all over the city. Unless you know something they don't, I don't see any reason we should go out there.
First off, fuckhead, no one invited you. Second, where I'm going is none of your business.
Turning his attention back to Carla, Jerry paused for a second, then continued.
You're right, though. There could be more of them back there. Is there a way I could get up on the roof and go get a look?
No, not from the inside. But what about the guy that's up there? He could be one of them.
She had a point. For all he knew, that guy could be just as dangerous as the freaks pounding on the windows. Nodding, Jerry walked over to the coolers and grabbed a bottle of water. While the idea of staying in the store wasn't appealing, going out there blind wasn't much better. As he took his first sip, Bridget called out.
Hey, I think Justin might need some help. He's passed out.
Everyone turned to see Greg dragging an unconscious Justin out of the restroom. He was covered in vomit, and the wound on his arm was leaving a blood streak on the floor. The wound itself didn't look that bad, but it wouldn't stop bleeding. When Carla noticed it, she looked nervous.
Hey, the news is saying that bites are spreading some kind of virus. Was he bitten?
Everyone got quiet for a second. No one knew how he'd been injured. Hearing the news, Greg dropped the unconscious man and stepped back. That's definitely a bite mark. Are you sure that's what they said? Nodding her head, Carla slowly put her phone down and grabbed the hammer she kept under the register.
The reporter said there's something in the saliva that stops the blood from clotting. And the victims that manage to get away pass out and bleed to death. And then they come back. We have to get him out of here before he...
She didn't get a chance to finish talking. Justin's eyes popped open and his hand shot out, grabbing Bridget by the leg. Before anyone could move, he bit into her calf and was pulling away a mouthful. Screaming and snatching her leg away, Bridget lost her balance and tumbled into Greg, who caught her out of reflex. That moment was all it took. Justin scrambled to his feet and attacked both of them. It was instant chaos. Harold and Tammy closed themselves in the walk-in beer cooler, leaving Jerry and Carla to deal with the situation. Carla, who was behind the counter, ducked, attempting to hide. Now Jerry was basically alone. The commotion was stirring up the ones outside. The sound of their hands pounding against the glass was nerve-wracking. Jerry couldn't focus. All he wanted to do was not be there, seeing what he was seeing. Nervously pulling his pistol, he put all of his attention on the storeroom and made a break for it. As he passed the last section of shelves, Justin noticed him. Covered in blood and snarling, he rushed forward, closing the distance. There was no time to think, no time to focus. Jerry brought the gun up and fired 4 shots. All of them hit, but none of them stopped him. The barrage knocked him down and bought Jerry just enough time to get into the storeroom. With his back pressed against the door, he scanned the room till he spotted the exit Carla mentioned. It was on the far side of the room. He'd have to run for it and pray that no one was on the other side, but it was better than the alternative. Taking a few deep breaths and closing his eyes, he tried to gather himself. The constant banging and snarling was making it hard to concentrate, but when he heard the glass of the storefront shatter, he knew time was up. On the count of 3, he pushed off and ran for the exit. When the door swung open, he was surprised to see the path was clear. From where he was standing, he could see the brick wall that separated the gas station from the neighborhood and the clothing donation boxes at the edge of the parking lot. He knew there was no way he'd be able to outrun the crowd, so he took his chances and headed for the wall. It was a little under 6 feet tall, so getting over it wouldn't be hard, But as soon as he got to it, one of the freaks saw him. Letting out a guttural roar, a half-naked old man rushed forward, headed his way. Gripping the top of the bricks and pulling himself up, Jerry felt hands clawing at his legs. He kicked and screamed, praying he didn't get bit as he climbed over, then fell, landing flat on his back. Staring up at the sky, he laid there for a moment, listening to the old man groan and growl before he sat up. He'd landed in someone's backyard, behind a garage. Slowly getting up and making his way to the edge of the building, he peeped around the corner. From his position, he could see out to the street. There didn't appear to be anyone around, but he couldn't be sure. Slowly stepping out and looking around, the first thing he noticed was the back door of the house was open. There were clothes along with a few bottles of water and a broken baseball bat on the ground near the patio. As he cautiously moved closer, the sound of something rummaging around inside froze him in his tracks. Fighting the urge to announce himself, Jerry kept his eyes on the doorway and tried to sneak past. When he stepped into the driveway, a scream came from inside the house. Then 3 mangled figures charged out after him. Running as fast as he could, Jerry raced across the street with the snarling trio of freaks hot on his heels. Ahead of him, a car blocked the driveway, leading to the backyard of the next house. There was just enough room for him to squeeze by without breaking stride. The freaks, on the other hand, weren't coordinated enough to navigate the space, and they got jammed up. Making a quick right, then a left, he dipped behind the garage and scrambled over the fence to the next yard. The freaks weren't giving up. They slammed into the fence, knocking a few boards loose, and were reaching their arms through, swiping at him. Winded and fighting for breath, Jerry crossed the yard, barely able to keep himself upright. When he'd made it to the rear of the house, he sent up a silent prayer and tried the door. He nearly started crying when the knob turned, and it opened. Quickly getting inside and locking it, he pushed a table in front of it, then sat in a chair and tried to compose himself. He'd gone 3 blocks and nearly died twice. At this rate, he'd never make it home. Once he'd caught his second wind, he immediately got up and started checking the house. To the left of the kitchen, there was a laundry room with a big window overlooking the backyard. By the looks of it, whoever lived here had been washing. There was a load of dirty clothes in a basket near the washing machine, and a second basket filled with folded towels on top of the dryer. The kitchen was small and clean aside from a few dishes in the sink. There were a few soap bubbles in the water, so he stuck a finger in to check the temperature. It was still slightly warm. Pulling his pistol and moving to the living room, the first thing he saw was a giant flat-screen TV mounted on the wall. It was on, but the sound was muted. The news was showing scenes of mass attacks from nearly every state. When they switched to a color chart of the map, Jerry's jaw dropped. Everything was red. Something about seeing it laid out like that made his heart drop. There was nowhere to go. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the screen, till a low thumping sound caught his attention. For the first few seconds, it seemed like it could be coming from outside, but as he stepped towards the hall leading to the rest of the house, it got louder. Heart racing, he cautiously moved for the first door to his right. It had been left slightly open, and judging by the tiled floor, he guessed it was the restroom. Pushing it open, he confirmed it. There was nothing out of the ordinary. A tub, toilet, and sink, with a medicine cabinet/mirror combo over it. Seeing that it was empty, he glanced down the hall. There were 3 more doors. 1 to his immediate left, and 2 at the end, 1 on either side. All of the doors were open. The room closest to him looked like it belonged to a teenager. There were tennis shoes and clothing on the floor. The bed was a mess, and there was a desk with a gaming rig against the far wall. Stepping inside, he did a quick check, then moved on to the next room. This one was smaller than the first, and had been converted into an art studio. There were amazing paintings and sketches on the walls, and dropped clothes lining the floor. In the center, there was an angled drawing table next to a shelf cluttered with art supplies and extra paper. That only left one room, and he could clearly hear the thumping sound coming from across the hall. Choking down the lump in his throat, he went to check it out. It was the master bedroom and had a restroom of its own. The thumping sound was coming from inside. Chapter 8. Wrong Side of the Tracks. Staring down at the crowd, Daniel tried to wrap his mind around what he was seeing. The horde of snarling lunatics was pounding on the windows of the gas station. Something inside was stirring them up. It wouldn't be long before they got in. As that thought crossed his mind, gunshots from inside the store made him jump. A few seconds later, the window shattered, and the horde poured into the building. Lucky for him, he'd been on the roof. If he'd managed to get inside, he'd be one of the ones screaming instead of listening to them. A loud bang from the back of the building got his attention. As he turned to get a look, a guy in a security guard uniform climbed over the wall that separates the store from the neighborhood. Behind the guard, grabbing at his legs, was the same old man he'd seen earlier. When the guard vanished behind the wall, the old man stayed there for a while, clawing at the bricks and snarling, before finally running off to join the others. With the crowd occupied, Daniel started looking for a way out. In order to get to Sydney's house, he'd need to cross the street and head down 12 Mile Road. There was a lot of ground to cover, and most of it would be out in the open. There was no way he could make the trip without being seen. Taking a second to look around, he noticed a couple of cars left on the street and an SUV sitting at the pumps. The SUV was too close to the store. He'd get spotted as soon as he got to it. There was a car in the lot with a broken window, but it was a little too close as well. Near the driveway, there was a Mercedes with its driver's side door open. If he got lucky, there was a chance he could get to it, but he'd have to cross the front of the store to get there. Keeping that in mind, he glanced at the last option. It was a newer model Jeep with a soft top. The engine was running. You could see steam coming from the exhaust. The problem was, the Jeep was sitting in the middle of the street. Best case scenario, he'd get to it and drive away, being chased by a few of those things down there. Worst case, he'd have to run away and pray he didn't get caught before he could find someplace safe. With the only other option being going on foot, he decided to make a run for the Jeep. Following the route he'd taken to get on the roof, Daniel went to the side of the building the box truck was parked on. Once he'd climbed over the ledge and gotten on top of the truck, he paused for a moment, listening to the screams coming from inside the gas station. If the screaming stopped, he'd have no chance of getting to the street. It was now or never. Taking a few deep breaths and psyching himself up, he carefully climbed down, then took off running. As soon as he cleared the building, one of the stragglers spotted him. It was the old man again. He seemed slower now. It was easier to outrun him, but more were on the way. Sprinting through the parking lot, Daniel glanced back and saw two of the faster ones coming. Focusing on the car and pushing himself harder, he cleared the lot and was on the street before they were anywhere near him. There was just enough time to get to the Jeep. As soon as the door slammed shut, the duo of drooling ghouls crashed into the side of the car. He couldn't help but get excited as he put it in gear and drove away. Smiling and picking up speed, a sudden realization almost made him hit the brakes. He'd forgotten his bag and the baseball bat on the roof.
Fuck.
Shaking his head and mashing the gas, he sped past the first few houses before there was another problem. A flashing red light from the fuel gauge nearly brought tears to his eyes as he came to a stop. The car had been sitting in front of the gas station running all night. He should have known better. It was another bad decision to add to the list, and things were about to get worse. His escape attracted a lot of attention. Every ghoul within earshot was now running and hobbling towards him. Catching a glimpse of the undead wave in the rearview mirror made him gasp. They were still a good distance away, but some of them were moving fast. He didn't have time to waste. Quickly looking around the inside of the Jeep, he found a 4-way tire iron and a plastic bag with some protein bars in it. Grabbing the loot and getting out, he hurried over to the sidewalk closest to him and climbed over the fence. He knew exactly where he was. He passed this elementary school dozens of times coming from Sid's place. By the time he cleared the field and reached the playground, the first part of the crowd was arriving at the Jeep. They hadn't seen him yet, and thanks to the playground equipment blocking their view, he had time to think. He was just about to break into the school when he glanced up. There was a heavy-set woman wearing a nightgown that caught his attention. The back of her gown was ripped, exposing a shredded mass of flesh. From the back of her neck to the crack of her ass, all the skin had been stripped away. What was left was an oozing, jiggling mass of fat deposits and shredded tendons. Wincing, Daniel watched till she turned away, then he took off running to his right. Rounding the corner, he found himself behind the building, following a driveway that led to the next block. He hadn't gone far before the lady in the nightgown came rumbling around the corner after him. Huffing and growling, she closed the distance, excitedly swiping at him as she zeroed in. She was so close, he could smell her. A foul combination of blood, cheap perfume, and fecal matter made his lungs burn. Thinking fast, he tightened his grip on the tire iron, then stopped and ducked in one motion. As the bloody, blubbery mass overshot him, he stood up straight, then rocked back and swung the tire iron as hard as he could. The meaty crack of it hitting her skull sent a chill through his body before she gargled, then dropped at his feet. There was a moment of shock before he started muttering,
No.
and put his hands on his head. Nervously pacing in a circle, trying not to look at what he'd just done, Daniel paused to rub his face. There was something on his cheek. As he pulled his hand away and saw blood, his stomach lurched. Fighting the urge to vomit, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. That tire iron had just saved his life, but now it was stuck in some old lady's head, and he needed it back. Slowly looking at the corpse laying a few feet away, he just saw how much damage he'd done. It had been a downward swing that caught her on the side of the head as she turned to attack. The angle of the strike punched a hole in her skull and blew out her left eye when it broke through the socket. Hoping it would come out as easy as it went in, he walked over and tried to grab it. The first attempt lifted her head and barely moved it. The second attempt wasn't much better and resulted in a series of vomit-worthy sounds that nearly made him give up. Finally, bracing her head with his foot and working it free, he managed to pull it out. His reward, aside from the tire iron, was a spurt of brain sludge that splattered against his shins and forearms. Between the smell and the runny egg-like texture, Daniel's stomach couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out of there. Following the driveway had taken him off course. He'd have to go back to his left and pass through another neighborhood to get to Sydney's place. After the last time, he was hesitant, but going to the right would take him back to the gas station. Neither path was clear. There were people all over the place. Some were loading into cars, while others were boarding up their windows as the sound of helicopters and sirens echoed through the city around them. Seeing what was ahead of him and knowing what was coming, he turned left and started running, doing his best to warn everyone. He yelled,
"They're coming!"
as he darted down the street. Those 2 words triggered a chain of events that would be stuck in his mind forever. A somewhat civilized exodus turned into a mini riot in a heartbeat. Groups of people that had been begging for rides turned and started running. The ones that had been loading up dropped what they were doing and immediately got into their vehicles. The combination created chaos. Horns were blaring, fights broke out, and things quickly spiraled out of control. Still running, Daniel glanced back over his shoulder just before he had made a left onto Lloyd Street. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The crowd that had been chasing him earlier had doubled in size and was now spilling out of the alley he'd come through. Seeing them spread out and start attacking everyone was breathtaking. Shouting and arguing turned into screams of absolute terror as the horde overran the street. The fast ones came first. They bum-rushed in, tackling victims and slamming into cars, shattering their windows. The lucky few that managed to drive away had to plow through the slower ones that were gathering around them. The rest were either eaten alive or trapped in their cars waiting to die. Mesmerized by the scene unfolding in front of him, Daniel watched for a few more seconds before jogging away. All he had to do now was make it to the next street, turn left, and go all the way to the end. From there, he could climb up the embankment at the edge of the neighborhood and cross the railroad tracks. Sydney's place was on the first street after the tracks. If he played his cards right, he'd come out close to it. It sounded easier than it actually was. The path to the street he needed was clear, but the moment he turned left, everything changed. There was at least 40 homes on this street, and every one of them seemed to be occupied. The scene was a mirror image of what he'd just been through. People were scrambling around, completely unaware of what was happening on the next block. Jogging to the median, then slowing to a brisk walk, he started out. The first block went by with no problems. He'd gotten a few odd looks, but no one approached him. Crossing the next intersection, he took a look down the road leading in and almost stopped. From where he was standing, the front of the school was visible, and he could see 3 or 4 of those things in the parking lot. Picking up the pace and moving on his brisk walk, went back to a jog, then a full-out sprint once people started screaming. Weaving around trees and bushes in the median, he smiled when the incline came into view. Lungs burning, muscles aching, Daniel passed the last few houses and climbed the rusty chain-link fence. When he got to the other side, he paused for a second to catch his breath and look around. Everything was overgrown on this side, but he quickly found a way through and started climbing. Halfway up the hill, he paused, partially because he needed to rest, but mostly because a part of him wanted to watch. Turning around and squatting in the bush, he peered out into the street. From his hiding spot, he had a clear view of both sides of the street, but trees in the median blocked him from seeing further. Gunshots from nearby sent a small group of people running. He couldn't see who was shooting till a guy on the right side of the street fired back. The first set of shots had come from a tan 2-story, 3 houses down on the left. Shifting over a little to get a better look, Daniel narrowed his focus and caught a glimpse of a man standing near the front of the house, firing at people as they ran away. The guy who fired back was crouched near the end of a black SUV in the driveway of the house on the right. The shootout didn't last long, and no one got hurt, but the damage was done. There were already a few ghouls further up the block, but that little exchange brought a wave no one was prepared for. A snarling stampede of runners rushed in from the access road, followed by the rest. In no time, They were flooding the street. There were too many to count. Daniel guessed there were at least 40 or 50, but it could have been more. He silently watched whole families get devoured as the horde rolled through. He was amazed by the way they moved. It was like watching lions take down prey. The runners did the work so the rest could eat. It was fascinating and hard to watch, but he couldn't take his eyes off of them. He would have watched them all day, but eventually they got a little too close for comfort, so he quickly snuck away, vanishing in the brush. Chapter 9. Blindsided. With a death grip on the steering wheel, Beth barely slowed the car down as she turned onto the next street. Meanwhile, her son, Andrew, sat silently in the passenger seat, watching helicopters circle plumes of black smoke in the distance. He hadn't said a word since they left home, but Beth didn't have time to focus on him. The road was chaos. They'd wound up on the back streets, trying to find a way through. Every corner they turned took them on a trip through hell. Gnarled corpses and bloodstains decorated the landscape on most blocks. The rest were either jammed with people trying to escape, or war zones that were too dangerous to drive through. They'd been forced to go south, taking them off course. The plan was to go to her brother Patrick's house in Franklin. His home was set on the edge of Walnut Lake. It wasn't isolated, but there was plenty of land between him and his neighbors. It had been built to withstand storms and had solar panels along with gas-powered generators. If they could get there, they'd be safe for a while. But for now, Beth had to focus on getting off the road long enough to get her bearings. The first place she came to that seemed clear was PetSmart. The parking lot around the store was mostly empty, but there was a crowd across the lot, looting at Trader Joe's. Pulling up and parking as close to the door as possible, she turned to grab her backpack from the back seat and paused. For a moment, Andrew looked like his father, and it brought tears to her eyes. Everything had happened so fast, she hadn't had time to let it sink in. Roy was gone. He turned into one of those things and tried to kill her. She'd gotten up to use the restroom during the night. She returned to find Roy sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to her. When she asked if he was feeling better, his head popped up, and he started looking around like he was searching for something. The moment he spotted her, he snarled, then turned around and attacked. Lunging forward and crawling across the bed, growling and biting at the air, as if he could taste her. The flashback made her feel sick, but she didn't want to break down in front of Andrew. Grabbing her pack from the back seat, she dug around in it for a second, then pulled out a 9mm handgun and sat it in her lap. Turning her attention to Andrew, she took a breath and nodded to herself.
Drew, I need you to listen to me. I packed a gun in your bag with the GPS unit. Get them both out and hand them to me.
Doing as he was told, he grabbed his bag, pulled them out, and handed them over. His gun was a Walther PPK with an 8-round magazine. Giving it a quick once-over, Beth checked around into the chamber and handed it back. When Andrew reached out to take it, she tightened her grip and looked him in the eye.
Don't shoot unless you have to. This isn't the range. Your targets won't be standing still. Remember to breathe and keep both eyes open. If you need to reload, there's extra mags in your bag.
When Andrew nodded, Beth hesitated before releasing her grip.
Are you okay? You haven't made a sound since we got in the car.
Glancing down at the pistol, he shook his head no. His mother gave him a sad smile and finally let go.
Me neither.
The sound of gunfire from Trader Joe's snapped them back to reality. Grabbing the GPS and turning it on, Beth glanced over at the crowd. There was a man standing in the bed of a red pickup truck, holding a shotgun. Most of the crowd was running away, but there was a handful of people surrounding the truck. Beth didn't realize they weren't normal till one of them broke away and attacked someone. A large, muscular man wearing gray sweats and a black t-shirt dove on a woman as she ran by. They hit the ground hard, and he immediately tore into her. She kicked and screamed as he sank his teeth into her face and tore away a mouthful of flesh. The bite took her right cheek and the skin around her right eye, all the way up to her scalp. It stretched, pulling away a few strands of hair before snapping and slapping against the man's chin as he chewed on his first bite. Beth didn't want to see any more. Turning her attention back to the GPS, she pulled up Pat's location and handed it to Andrew.
Take us out, Mr. Chekhov.
Giving his mother a slightly confused look and glancing at the GPS, Andrew paused.
Who's Mr. Chekhov?
Closing her eyes and shaking her head in mock disgust, Beth put the car in drive and replied,
From Star Trek.
Star Trek? What's that?
Just tell me which way we're going.
The route they took led through a massive residential area, but it kept them off the main roads. The first few blocks were hard to navigate. The streets were packed, and they had to redirect several times before getting back on the right path. After half an hour, they came to a clear stretch of road and picked up speed. As they passed through an intersection, a mail truck ran the stop sign and clipped the rear of their car. The impact instantly put them on a collision course with a pair of trees on the right side of the street. Beth had just enough time to scream before they hit. Then everything went black. Chapter 10. Crossroads. The sound coming from the restroom sent Jerry's mind racing through possibilities. After nearly dying 5 times in the last 48 hours, the last thing he wanted was another problem. If there was one of those freaks behind that door, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop it. If there was a normal person in there, the odds were he'd get shot as soon as he opened it. Deciding it was safer to ignore it, he slowly backed down into the hall, then locked the room door from the inside and closed it. Taking a moment to calm down, he slipped his gun back into his holster and stood there listening to the commotion outside. The crack of gunfire in the distance, mixed with the sirens, helicopters, and the occasional scream created a soundtrack that made it hard to focus. Originally, he'd been heading home, but since no place was safe and he was on foot, he needed another plan. Slowly making his way back to the main room, something caught his eye. As he passed the kid's room, he spotted a backpack on the floor near the gaming setup. It wasn't all that big, but it could hold bottles of water and a few other things. When he stepped inside to grab it, he froze. There was someone standing outside the window. The blinds were closed, but he could see the silhouette of someone's head rocking from side to side. Eyes glued to the shadow, Jerry moved cautiously, thinking whoever it was could come crashing in at any moment. Step for step, breath for breath, he counted the seconds till he gripped the strap of the backpack. As he lifted it, the person outside the window stopped rocking and started rapidly turning its head from left to right, searching for something. Jerry's heart dropped into the pit of his stomach, and his hand started shaking. He felt flush. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as the world around him seemed to fade away. There was nothing but him, the window, and whatever was on the other side of it. The nerve-wracking sounds from outside became white noise, highlighted by the low hum of the box fan sitting in the corner. For a split second, he imagined the window exploding inwards as some grotesque ghoul forced its way in. At that exact moment, a car sped down the street, and the figure took off running after it. Letting out a breath, he hadn't realized he was holding. Jerry looked up at the ceiling and shook his head.
This is a dream. A bad fucking dream. I'm gonna wake up and laugh about this shit tomorrow.
As he muttered those words to himself, the sound of a helicopter passing overhead brought him back to reality. This wasn't going away. If he was going to survive, he needed to focus. Quietly making his way to the main room and taking a seat on the couch, he watched the emergency broadcasts. Most of it was the same as he'd heard in the gas station. Stay inside. Avoid contact with the infected. Bites are lethal. Scratches are okay. And if you're infected, quarantine. Of course, there were the reports of rioting and looting he'd expected to see. But near the end of the segment, they announced evacuation sites would be operational by dawn. There were 3 in the northern side of the city: Quickstead, Cummington, and Memorial. The military would be screening evacuees and transporting everyone who wasn't sick to what they were calling safe zones. The so-called safe zones looked a lot like internment camps, and Jerry wanted no part of it. Being crammed into a tent with dozens of other people seemed like a problem waiting to happen. On the other hand, the news reports said the sites would be handing out supplies to the ones who chose not to evacuate. 2 weeks worth of MREs, water purification tablets, and first aid kits. It wasn't much, but if he could make it to all 3 locations, he'd have a nice little stockpile to fall back on. Quickstead was the closest. In a car, it was a short trip, but on foot, it might take all day. If he could get close before nightfall and find a place to hide till morning, it might be worth the risk. Getting to the other 2 would be difficult. There was almost no way he could hit all 3 on foot in one day. Getting up from his seat and going to the window, he peeped out the blinds. There were bodies littering the lawn of the house across from him. One of them was moving. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Its head was an exposed skull, with a few bits of skin dangling off of it. The torso had been eaten clear through to the spine, and the legs had been ripped off, but it was still dragging itself across the lawn. Backing away from the window, Jerry pulled his pistol and checked the magazine. He had 7 rounds left, with 2 extra mags on his belt. Since this started, he'd only managed to kill one of those things, and that had been a lucky shot. He'd been taught to aim for center mass. Headshots on moving targets were a problem, unless he was up close. That wasn't an option, so for now, the only thing he could do was keep his distance. Still trying to come up with a plan, he glanced around the living room till he caught his reflection in the mirror hanging behind the bar. Rubbing the stubble on his face and shaking his head, he unbuttoned his uniform and took it off. The last thing he wanted was strangers asking him for help. For some reason, when people saw the uniform and gun, they instantly assumed he was supposed to swoop in and save the day. Tossing his shirt down and heading for the laundry room, he paused when he saw the president making a speech on television. Skimming through the captions as they scrolled by, Jerry sneered at the screen, then flipped him a middle finger and went to find another shirt. When he got to the laundry room and looked out the window, he noticed the freaks weren't at the gate. He'd passed a car on the way in. If he went back over the fence, he could get to it. The problem was getting it started. He'd either have to find the keys or hotwire it, and he had no idea how to do that. Grabbing a plain black t-shirt out of the dirty clothes and putting it on, Jerry frowned. The shirt smelled like spoiled milk and was too small. After searching for a while longer, he came up with a gray hoodie that fit. Satisfied with his new look, he grabbed the backpack and went to the refrigerator. Inside, he found an unopened gallon of water, beer, soda, juice, and leftovers. After loading the backpack, he went back to the living room, took a seat on the couch, and pulled out his phone. According to Google Maps, there were 12 blocks between him and the Quickstead location. Going by the fact that it had taken him a little over an hour to get this far, Jerry guessed the trip would take around 6 hours. Putting his phone away and focusing on the television, he watched scene after scene of the infected. As the images flashed by, he started noticing something. A large number of the infected had similar wounds. The arms, legs, neck, and face were almost always damaged. Holding his arms out and looking at them, he realized the wounds were defensive. He was going to need a way to protect himself against bites. Thinking back to the laundry room, an image of duct tape flashed in his mind. 2 rolls on the shelf with the detergent. Smiling to himself and hopping up, he hurried off to gather a few things. 2 pairs of socks, the duct tape, scissors, and an unopened package of microfiber cleaning cloths. First, he cut finger holes into the socks, turning them into gloves that would cover his hands, wrists, and forearms. Once that was done, he used the tape to secure the cleaning cloths to his forearms and pulled the gloves over that. Next, he wrapped the gloves in duct tape, creating gauntlets that protected from his hands to just below his elbow. It was fairly comfortable, but he would have to get used to the stiffness till they were broken in. Covering his shoulders to just above his elbow was a little more complicated. He wound up using the black t-shirt as a base and wrapping tape around the areas he needed covered. Lastly, he rolled up his pant legs and wrapped his calves down to the edge of his boots. Feeling protected, Jerry pulled on the gray hoodie over his armor, then checked his reflection in the mirror. For a second, he wished he'd come up with a way to cover his neck, but the truth was, if they were that close, he was probably dead anyway. Now that he was ready, he practiced pulling his pistol a few times. It was a little awkward at first, but once he thinned the padding on his palms and retaped them, he was good to go. There was one last thing he needed to do before he hit the road. Grabbing a plastic 2-liter bottle out of the trash, he went back to the bar. After picking out 2 bottles of whiskey and filling the 2-liter, he packed it in his bag. He was ready to go. Peeping out the front window to assure the coast was clear, he was shocked. The corpse he'd seen earlier had dragged itself away, and the street seemed clear. His plan was to keep out of sight by crossing through yards and hopping fences. Once he was close to the Quickstead evacuation site, he'd find a place to hide and wait till morning. Taking one last look around the house, he nodded to himself, then headed out. Moving as quickly as possible, he stepped out the front door and checked the street again. Now that he was outside, he could see both ends of the block. The main roads were active with cars and freaks. The news of the evacuation must have gotten people stirred up. Everyone was trying to get there early, to be first in line. Ignoring the commotion and focusing on his path, Jerry cautiously made his way across the street. The first house went great. He made it through the yard and over the fence in no time. He was halfway through the next yard when a woman's scream followed by a splash caught his attention. Creeping over to the fence on his right, Jerry listened for a second before climbing up to look. There was a woman in a swimming pool, surrounded by 3 or 4 freaks that were in the process of falling in with her. Lowering himself back down and moving on, he tried not to listen to the screams. By the time he made it to the house, she'd gone silent. Now, there was splashing and snarling coming from over there. Shaking his head and turning his attention to the house, he noticed the windows were boarded up. Whoever was inside wasn't planning on coming out. That was fine by him. He passed by quickly and stopped when he hit the sidewalk. There were people on this block scrambling to get their windows covered, and piling into cars trying to leave. While it was good to see some normal people, the situation forced him to go a few houses down before he could cut through another yard. This time, things didn't go so smoothly. He was chased by a Rottweiler that managed to bite his calf. He'd felt the pressure, but the teeth hadn't gone through. He was able to kick the dog off of him and get over the fence with nothing but a minor rip in his pant leg. Once he was on the other side of the fence, he checked his leg and smiled. His armor worked. It was a little bulky and hot, but it stopped the bites. Proudly smirking and getting up off the ground, he looked around and stopped. There was a boy staring at him through an upstairs window of the house. The moment they locked eyes, the kid snarled and started banging on the glass. The noise must have acted as an alarm. Pale, blood-stained faces appeared in all the windows, prompting Jerry to get the hell out of there. The glass shattered as he darted across the yard, headed for the street. Ahead of him, there was a 4-foot-high wrought iron gate separating the driveway from the back of the house.
Work smarter, not harder,
he muttered when he noticed the center of the gate was a walk-in with a simple lift lock. Slowing down to open it, the meaty smack of a body landing on the pavement made him flinch. Fighting the urge to turn around, he unlocked the gate and stepped out, then got a look when he closed and relocked it. A man wearing a white t-shirt and flannel pajama pants was slowly getting up off the ground. This one looked like it had been dead for a while. His skin was discolored, and the blood on his clothes was dry. All the freaks he'd seen before now were fast and aggressive, but this one was slow. Watching as it groaned and lumbered towards him, he thought about pulling his gun and shooting it. With his luck, the noise would attract the faster ones, and he'd be in trouble. Rather than wait for the ghoul to get to the gate, Jerry walked to the end of the driveway. This block was more active than the last. There were people everywhere. Across the street, there was a small park that he could cut through that would keep him out of sight. The problem was, there was no place to hide if something happened before he cleared it. In the center of the park, there was a fenced area with a few shipping containers and old equipment in it. Worst case scenario, he'd have to climb up on the containers and wait it out. With that in mind, he turned around and pointed to the zombie at the gate, then yelled,
"There's one over here!"
A few people close enough to hear him panicked and ran when they saw what he was pointing at. One of them, an older guy that had been loading bags into a Sprinter van, had a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. When he saw what was happening, he brought the rifle around, took aim, and fired. The freak's head snapped back, splattering brain matter on the pavement as he fell. That shot kicked the crowd into overdrive. Everyone was jumping into their cars and speeding out of there. Seeing his opportunity, Jerry calmly walked through the playground, keeping his eye out for more ghouls. When he made it to the other side, there was a decision to make. The path to the left would get him to pass the next block without having to jump any fences. The path to the right would get him past the next 4 blocks, but he would be out in the open. The truth was, if he had to keep jumping fences, he wasn't going to get very far. His legs were sore and his back was hurting. The path to the right was going to have to do. When he reached the end of the block and turned left onto the next street, he paused. There were blind spots. He wouldn't be able to see what was coming from the next street till he was halfway through the block. Pulling his gun and thumbing off the safety, he cautiously got moving. The first couple of blocks were nerve-wracking, but he didn't see any zombies till he hit an intersection. By the look of it, a red pickup truck had blown through a stop sign and T-boned a small white Ford, tipping it over on its side. There were 3 zombies in the Ford, and the driver of the truck had turned. Lucky for Jerry, zombies didn't know how to use seatbelts. All 4 of them were trapped. Other than the dead guy behind the wheel, the truck looked to be in drivable condition. As Jerry got closer, the freak snarled and bit at the air, trying to get a taste of fresh flesh. Wincing at the sight of him, Jerry brought his gun up and took aim. There was a look of hatred in those cold, dead eyes that sent a chill down his spine. Whoever that guy had been was gone. Now, he was a mindless thing somewhere in between life and death. Exhaling and pulling the trigger, Jerry felt the kick of the pistol in his hand and saw the freak's head explode. The smell of cordite and scorched brain matter somehow made the moment feel unreal. For a second, he stood there watching clumps of skull and hair dripping from the dashboard. If it wasn't for one of the zombies in the Ford groaning, he might have stood there a lot longer. Snapping out of his daze, Jerry opened the driver's side door of the pickup and dragged the body out. Nothing could have prepared him for how disgusting moving a corpse could be. Aside from the slurry of brain, blood, and skull, there was the eye-watering stench of voided bowels. Urine and fecal matter had been seeping through the man's pants, leaving a stain on the seat. Fighting the urge to vomit, Jerry glanced around the cab and almost jumped for joy when he saw what was on the passenger side. Lying across the floorboard was a shotgun, along with several boxes of ammunition. He guessed everything had gotten thrown around in the wreck because one of the boxes had spilled shells all over the floor. Hurrying around to the passenger side, he spotted spent rounds in the bed of the truck. They weren't shotgun shells. By the looks of them, they were 5.56. Quickly scanning the bed for the rifle, he came up with nothing and moved on. When he opened the door, a couple of shells tumbled out and rolled onto the truck. Shrugging them off, he picked up the shotgun and racked it a few times, ejecting 2 more live rounds before going empty. Once he was reloaded, he slipped a few shells in each of his pockets, then packed the rest in his bag and tried to start the truck. After a few attempts, the engine rumbled to life. Mouthing a silent "thank you" and patting the dash, he closed the door and put it in drive. It hadn't taken long to do everything, but in that time, he gained an audience. A handful of zombies staggered and groaned as they approached. If that wasn't bad enough, the presence seemed to stir up the ones in the turned-over Ford. One of them had managed to squirm free and was crawling through the broken rear window of the car. Mashing the gas and swerving, Jerry ran over the crawler, then rolled past the approaching pack, honking the horn as he drove away. Traffic on the main roads was impossible to get through. Sticking to the back streets and feeling his way around took longer, but wound up being a lot safer. There were a few close calls, but in the end, he ran out of gas a few blocks away from his target. The military had already blocked off the streets and were setting up as the crowds gathered. It was unbelievable. There were people in huge groups begging to be let in early, while soldiers did their best to keep them back. Seeing the chaos from a distance, Jerry understood this had been a mistake. All it would take is 1 or 2 infected people in the crowd to turn the place into a graveyard. From what he could see, there were soldiers covering every way into the site, so he had to backtrack if he wanted to go around. Searching for a way out, Jerry looked across the street. There was an apartment complex that had been cleared out. The parking lot was empty, and he could see a few doors had been left open. Weaving through the incoming crowd, he crossed over and hurried into the first hallway leading into the apartments. The path led him to an enclosed set of units with a small lobby. As soon as he stepped inside, he closed the door and locked it. Gun in hand, he stood stock still, listening for movement. To his left, there was a set of stairs leading up to the shared walkway. There were 5 units up there, and all the doors were open. The wall to his right was lined with mailboxes, and there was a short hallway ahead of him, leading to the rest of the units in this building. There was also a rear exit that led to the parking lot behind the building. It didn't take long to search the place. There were 9 apartments. All but one of the doors was open, and that one was locked. When he knocked, no one answered, but he had the feeling there was someone in there. Once he was sure the building was secure, he picked out an upstairs apartment facing the street, then settled in and tried to get some rest. After raiding the refrigerator for cold pizza and a beer, Jerry sat by the window watching the growing crowd. Eventually, 2 days without sleep caught up to him, and he drifted off. The crack of gunfire snapped him awake. The sun had gone down, and all hell was breaking loose. When he sat up and looked out the window, his jaw dropped. There had to be hundreds of people on the street, surging against the barricades. In the rear of the crowd, people were screaming. At first, he couldn't see why, but when he got a better look, he saw the reason. Dozens of the undead were running into the crowd. The people in the rear were being torn apart, while the people at the front were trapped between them and the barricades. The order to open fire had come too late. The crowd surged. The gates fell, and now everyone was about to die. People poured in with the zombies. It was almost impossible to tell them apart. In no time, they were everywhere. Then things got worse. The military opened fire, mowing down everyone. It was a massacre. The problem was the zombies kept coming, and the people they'd gunned down were getting back up. What had taken days to get set up fell in a matter of minutes. The entire quick-stand evacuation site had been overrun and repopulated with a horde of flesh-eating ghouls. With tears in his eyes, Jerry watched the beginning of the end, and all he could do was cry. Chapter 11. Help. Standing on the railroad tracks, Daniel looked out over the neighborhood Sidney lived in. He'd been trying to get to his cousins for 2 days, and now he was just a few steps away. His view from the tracks gave him a good look at the street. There were a few zombies near the end of the block. If he played his cards right, they wouldn't see him. Once he could see Sid's backyard, he picked up the pace, then hurried down the embankment and climbed the fence. Happy to finally be there, he smiled, then cut across the yard. When he got to the patio door, his heart dropped. Inside, the living room was trashed. There was blood on the floor, and her front door had been smashed in. There was a pistol laying a few feet away from the pool of blood, and bags of groceries near what was left of the front door. He wanted to believe Sid had somehow made it out of there, but deep down, he knew she was gone. Glancing at the tire iron in his hand, then back to the .357 laying inside, he thought about grabbing it. He didn't want to go in, but the gun was a lot better than a tire iron. Sliding open the patio door, he was immediately hit by the smell. The aroma of rotten flesh, mixed with vomit and fecal funk, turned his stomach. Pausing for a moment, he pulled the scarf around his neck up, turning it into a mask covering his mouth and nose. It wouldn't completely block out the smell, but it was better than nothing. The metal-framed steampunk goggles he'd been wearing on his head weren't just for show. They were well made and had high-definition lenses that made everything sharper. Pulling them on and adjusting them, he took a deep breath, then stepped inside. Going straight for the gun, he picked it up and turned to leave, but a sound stopped him. He could have sworn he heard a shuffling coming from the hall, leading to the bedrooms. Hesitating to turn back, he stood still till he heard it again. This time it was clear. The slow swish of someone dragging their feet was getting louder. Slowly turning towards the source of the sound, he saw her shuffle out of the hall. It was Sid. She was covered in blood and clutching what looked like the remains of a dead cat in her hands. When she saw Daniel standing there, she groaned and reached out, dropping clumps of bloody cat chunks as she staggered towards him, arms hanging limply at his side. All he could do was stand there, staring at her. They'd been together since they were children. Being a year apart, they were more like brother and sister than anything else. When his mother kicked him out of the house, Sid's dad, Walter, who was his father's brother, took him in. From then on, the two of them stuck together through it all. Even as adults, the two were never far apart. Daniel was paralyzed, frozen in the moment like a deer in the headlights. She'd crossed the room and was a few steps away before he came to his senses. Turning his body to keep the gun away from her, he used his free hand to swat her arms down and stepped back. As she staggered, he quickly walked out of the patio door, leading her into the backyard. Sid snarled and bit at the air as she corrected herself, shuffling after her meal. Dragging her feet caused her to trip over the track that guides the sliding patio door. When she hit the ground and started crawling, Daniel finally saw how she died. From the back of her neck to the back of her thighs had been stripped down to the bone in some spots. The rest was a shredded mass of skin and tendons. Clutching the gun and watching her crawl towards him, he thought about shooting her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. This was Sid. He couldn't imagine hurting her. He knew if he didn't, she wouldn't stop coming, but he just couldn't do it. Stepping around her, he circled back to the door, then went inside and locked her out. He stood there for a moment, watching as she struggled back to her feet. Once she was up, she let out an almost defeated-sounding groan before staggering over to the patio door. Slapping a bloody hand against the glass, she tried to bind through it to get to Daniel as he watched. When he couldn't take it anymore, he turned his attention to the front door. The frame had been splintered to a couple of spots, but he was able to get the door back up and barricade it with furniture. Walking over to the refrigerator, he opened the freezer and managed a sad smirk. Sid kept a bottle of vodka on ice at all times. They'd mix it with Red Bull and Mountain Dew, then stay up all night playing Call of Duty and getting drunk. Grabbing the bottle, opening it, and taking a long drink, Daniel paused, listening to the dull thud of Sid bumping against the door. He didn't want to look at her. Seeing her that way made his heart hurt. They'd been making plans to visit Walter in Florida. Now, he had to tell him Sydney was gone. Shoving that thought to the back of his mind, he took another drink, then sighed before putting his head down and closing his eyes. Once he had gathered himself, Daniel went to the couch and drank till he blacked out. When he finally woke up, the sun had gone down and Sid wasn't at the window. An odd combination of sadness and relief washed over him. A part of him was glad that she'd wandered off, but in a way, he wished she hadn't. Somehow, not seeing her made it feel real. She was gone. He would never see her smile or hear her yelling at him for smoking all the weed. Wiping a tear away, Daniel grabbed the remote and turned on the television. The light hurt his eyes, but once they adjusted, His jaw dropped. It was later than he thought, 3:35 a.m. But that wasn't what shocked him. The news was showing footage of an evacuation site on the north side of the city being overrun. The dead were flooding the streets. Out of the 3 evacuation sites, there was only one left standing. The Cummington site was the largest and most heavily fortified, but judging by the size of the crowd trying to get in, there was no way they'd be able to take them all in. Muting the television, Daniel dug his phone out of his pocket and called Walter. It took 3 attempts before he got an answer, but the person who picked up wasn't Walt. A young-sounding woman picked up, speaking in an agitated tone.
Yeah, hold on.
After she put the phone down, Daniel heard her yell.
There's one right there! Shoot it!
Followed by several shotgun blasts. A few seconds later, the woman got back on the line.
Are you still there?
Who is this? Why do you have Walt's phone? Where is he?
Walter's driving the boat. He told me to answer it. This is Danny, right? You're the nephew? He told us about you.
Us? Who are you? What the hell's going on?
I'm Paula. Your uncle saved us from a pack of those things that had us cornered on the pier. If it weren't for him, we'd be dead. Oh, here he is. Hold on.
There was a slight pause, and Daniel could hear his uncle telling her to keep an eye out for other boats before he got on the phone.
Danny, are you okay? Where's Sydney? I'm coming to get you. It's gonna take a while, so I need you two to find a safe place and stay put till I get there.
Daniel choked up. It was hard to get the words out without his eyes welling up. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, he closed his eyes and tried to talk.
Sid's... she's gone.
Walter went silent for a long moment, then asked,
Are you sure?
Sobbing, Daniel told him what had happened, and after another long pause, Walter cleared his throat.
Listen, I need you to get to Lake St. Clair. You don't have to go right away. It's gonna take a few weeks for me to get to you. I'll let you know when I'm close. We have to stay in contact. Phones are good for now, but you're gonna need a high-frequency marine radio if the lines go down. While you still have the internet, look up some marine supply stores. They'll have what you need. Most people won't be looting those places, so there should be some good supplies there. If you can't find the radio, go to St. Clair Harbor. Head east on 11 Mile. It's a long trip, but it will take you straight there. The harbor master will have a radio you can use. I love you, son. Stay safe. I'll see you soon.
Once the call was ended, Daniel sat staring at the pool of blood on the floor. He couldn't stay in this house knowing what happened. Besides that, the door was busted. Sooner or later, the dead would come calling, and there'd be no way to keep them out. He already knew Sid didn't have a backpack, and the only other weapon in the house was a can of bear spray, so there was no point in searching. Thinking about it for a second, he remembered her having a laundry bag that had shoulder straps. That thing could carry 2 weeks' worth of dirty clothes. It could easily hold everything he needed. Finding the bag didn't take long. It was where it always was, in her closet, stuffed with last week's clothes. After emptying it, he went to the kitchen. As usual, she had a case of ramen noodles, energy drinks, and a couple of cases of water. The noodles were light, so he took all of them. He could get water anywhere, but he took a couple of bottles just in case. There were a few other odds and ends, like snack cakes, candy, and chips. Daniel made sure to grab some before going to Sid's stash. Inside a modest-looking wooden box was a little under a pound of some of the best weed he'd ever had. She'd gotten it from a pal of hers that owned a dispensary. Sticking his face in the box and breathing deep, Daniel closed his eyes and smiled. He remembered the night she'd gotten it. They rolled the biggest spliff they'd ever seen and smoked the whole thing while playing Skyrim with VR glasses. Shaking his head and slipping the box into his pack, he sighed and headed for the patio. While passing through the living room, he realized he hadn't checked the bags near the front door. Stopping and putting the pack down, he opened it and took the box back out. As much as he wanted to keep it, it was taking up too much space. The bag inside would have to do. Rather than leave the box sitting around for anyone to find, Daniel filled it with supplies and hid it just in case he had to come back. The bags next to the door were filled with beef jerky, Spam, dried fruits, and nuts. But best of all, there was a box of bullets for the .357. After loading his pack, Daniel pulled up a map of the city on his phone to look at the location Walter gave him. With Sid's car, the trip should take less than an hour. But, considering how bad it was out there, it would take a lot longer. He would still have to find a good place to hide, but that could wait. For now, the road was more important. Once he'd marked off a few spots along the way, he downloaded the map to his phone and put it away. Dawn came quicker than he would have liked, but it was time to go. Picking up his pack and grabbing Sid's keys off of the bar, Daniel looked around the room one last time. Taking a deep breath and shaking off the flashbacks, he walked to the patio door to get a look around. When he was sure the coast was clear, he made his move. Sid's car, a '95 Caprice Classic, was sitting in the driveway. All he had to do was get in and drive away. Unfortunately, there was no such thing as an easy day in the apocalypse. A female zombie, naked from the waist down, was standing near the driver's side door. Off to her right, two others aimlessly shuffled around the neighbor's yard. One was an older guy with a bandage on his arm. He wasn't covered in blood like the others, but he was dead all the same. The other one was a teenager, caked in dried blood. His arms had been chewed up, and his clothes were torn, but Daniel could still make out Rick and Morty on his t-shirt. Before this moment, seeing the dead lumbering around scared him senseless. Now, Daniel felt something else. A deep, burning hatred replaced the fear and steadied his hand. He wanted to destroy them, rip off their arms and legs, then bash in their skulls. Burn them, blow them up, run them over, whatever it took to get rid of every last one of them. Without thinking, he brought the gun up to eye level, clutching it with both hands as he took aim. Finally noticing Daniel standing there, the female zombie turned to face him while letting off a gurgling sound, alerting the others. When she took a step, Daniel pulled the trigger. There was an explosion of light and sound as the recoil sent a shockwave of energy through his forearms. The sensation was overwhelming, but it didn't feel bad. When he pulled it a second time and hit his target, he found himself liking it. The shot hit her squarely in the forehead, decorating the windshield with blood and brain matter. As her body dropped, Daniel stepped around the front of the car, taking aim at the man with the bandage on his arm. This one was slightly faster than the other two. It lunged forward as Daniel fired, causing him to miss and giving it a chance to get closer. Stepping back, Daniel fired again. The shot was off. It hit the man's shoulder, knocking him against the car as the kid in the Rick and Morty shirt passed him. Now, there were two of them lumbering towards him, and the noise was attracting others from the street. With time running out, Daniel pulled the trigger till the gun clicked empty. One of his last two shots dropped the kid, causing the man with the bandage arm to trip over him and fall. Seeing the opportunity to make his escape, Daniel hurried over to the car, got in, and cranked the engine. Sid hated backing out onto the street, so she always backed into her driveway so she could pull out easier. Smiling at the thought of her, Daniel put it in drive and sped off. The first few blocks were crawling with the dead. Nearly every house he passed had been overrun. The few that hadn't were either empty or boarded up so well no one could get in. Ahead of him, on the right, a tower came into view. It was a shrine. The name escaped him at the moment, but he remembered passing it a few times over the years. After swerving around a few wrecked cars and avoiding packs of the dead, he was pulling up to the building. The place was built like a fortress. Judging by the number of cars in the parking lot, he guessed he wasn't the only one who thought so. Slowing down as he approached the intersection, a surge of movement caught his eye. There was a group of people looting a pawn shop on the corner. For a second, he thought about joining them, but when he saw a dozen or so zombies running towards them, he hit the gas. The further he went, the worse it got. At one point, he saw a bus filled with people surrounded by the dead. The streets were so packed, he had to drive on the sidewalks to get by. On the next block, the Civil Motel was on fire. Burning figures resembling the Human Torch were walking around, setting everything they touched on fire. It was like staring directly into hell. Daniel thought he could almost see the devil in the smoke from the burning building. By the time he'd reached his turn, more than an hour had passed. At this point, he wouldn't get to the harbor till late in the day. Just making the turn took some maneuvering. The intersection was packed with cars that had been flooding the gas station. Most of them were empty, but there were more than a few with zombies still strapped in their seats. Bodies that had been too destroyed to reanimate littered the ground around the gas station. It looked like a tornado had hit the place. The windows were shattered, and the doors had been broken down. As he passed, a group of slow-moving stragglers shuffled towards the car. Daniel noticed a few of them were soldiers. One in particular still had an M4 slung over his shoulder. Slowing to a stop, he watched the drooling pack of ghouls hobbling and shuffling their way to him. That rifle could be a game changer, but getting it without getting mauled was a challenge. He hadn't stopped to reload, and with his luck, he'd probably miss most of his shots anyway. The sudden realization that he could hit them with the car made him smile as he put it in reverse and hit the gas. Once there was a decent distance between him and his target, he threw it in drive and went for it. The sound of them smacking against the hood of the car was oddly satisfying. His first attempt took out 2 of the 5 and knocked the others down. Putting the car in reverse, he made another pass. This time, he took out 1, but the other 2 were too damaged to get up. Spotting the M4 on the ground, Daniel quickly got out and ran over to get it. Other than a few scratches and a little blood, the rifle wasn't damaged. Picking it up and checking the mag, he smiled, then hurried back to the car. He was almost there when a dull thudding sound caught his attention. Slowly turning to see where it was coming from, he caught sight of a woman in a Honda, waving at him. When he focused on her, she let her window down and yelled out.
Are they all gone?
Glancing at the 2 zombies crawling around, he took aim at one and fired, then turned to her and nodded. The woman quickly got out of the car with a kid Daniel hadn't noticed before. The kid, a little girl, looked to be around 7 or 8 years old, with long dark hair. The woman looked like she could be in her early 20s, with short auburn hair and a semi-athletic build. When the duo ran over to him, Daniel stepped back.
Whoa, slow down. Where are you going?
You gotta help us. Please, you gotta get us out of here.
There wasn't a lot of time to stand around arguing. The noise he'd made attracted every zombie in the area. There were a dozen of them pouring out of the buildings. With a nod of his head, the three of them hurried over to the car and piled in. Daniel cranked the engine and they sped away, just as the first of the runners reached the rear.